If the mic is on, I can say welcome, good morning. I'm Corby Kummer. I won't speak as loudly if you'll turn the volume down a bit. And Charles Mann, our guest, just had the indiscretion to say to our friend Michael Kramer that I've been his editor since 1981. 1984.
Don't exaggerate.
Okay, that's right. So we're so much younger than we thought we were. And he also just said, when the very nice stage manager said, is there anything I can do for you? And he said, yes, could you make me a little smarter? Well, if there's anyone in this room who doesn't need to be a little smarter, it is Charles Mann. He knows a lot about everything. A lot of us can pride ourselves about knowing a little about many things. Charles, known as Cam, knows everything about everything. There's nothing he doesn't know about. But today, the subject is going to be climate change and how it grew up. The environmental movement grew up alongside the greatest scientific innovation perhaps ever in the history of helping populations flourish, which is the Green Revolution. Why the movements which grew up absolutely concurrently hate each other, don't talk to each other, and how the seeds were planted of this dissension. And it's a wonderful book, which is right here. You will memorize the name and the cover to go downstairs and buy it immediately upon the end of this panel. And if you're very good, the author might autograph it for you, in which he delineates these two characters who we'll be talking about. But we'd like to start with a small quiz. And that is, raise your hands if you believe climate change is a genuine phenomenon. Oh, we're so relieved. Okay. Now, raise your hands if you believe that excessive carbon dioxide is a major factor in climate change. Now, raise your hands if you know why, even in the most minute quantities, the mechanisms of how carbon dioxide leads to climate change. Okay, well, then you can lead along, the few of you who raised your hands, with Charles Mann's. My question to you is, could you give us a 3-minute summary that could refresh the memories of our admirably large number of people who know this, and then give us reasons to tell, as you said, our Aunt Dorothy, who next challenged us on this, how it actually takes place?
I mean, I'm sure all of you have an Aunt Dorothy who you have this uncomfortable conversation with over the dinner table at some point, and they say, I don't believe this, it's all a hoax. And because you don't know, most people don't know how it works, you are forced to say 97% of scientists believe this, which is a terribly weak argument. So I'm going to give you, in 3 minutes, the basics so that you can tell your Aunt Dorothy, and then if she doesn't listen, it's her own fault. Okay? So most of you know that the Earth is bathed 24/7 by sunlight, right? Okay. And this sunlight consists of all different kinds. We're going to start, right? I think your Aunt Dorothy will agree with this, right? So you ask Aunt Dorothy's with you so far. And this sunlight consists of all different kinds of radiation, right? Ultraviolet light, visible light, infrared light, you name it. All different kinds of radiation. About a third of this is bounced back from the cloud cover, the upper part of the atmosphere for all different reasons. The rest of it comes to the ground. You guys with me, right? Okay. And what does it do? It heats up stuff. And when things get warm, they emit infrared radiation. So all this different kinds of light comes in, and one kind of light goes out. If it didn't go out, the Earth would just get really, really hot, and it would be impossible to live here. So this is a good thing that the infrared light is going out. You guys are with me? Okay. Now, if this infrared light goes through the atmosphere is 99% oxygen and nitrogen. Infrared light isn't touched, can't be absorbed by them. So it just goes right through the atmosphere. If that was to happen, if the atmosphere is 100% oxygen and nitrogen, the Earth would get incredibly cold. But there's 1% of stuff, roughly 1% of stuff, that absorbs this infrared light and makes our Earth what it is. And most of that's water vapor. Water vapor doesn't absorb certain wavelengths of infrared light, certain types of infrared light. And that's like a safety valve. So it's like we're all sitting in a bathtub, and there's a water coming in, that's the infrared radiation, and there's these little holes that it comes out. And we're just sitting there comfortable because the holes, these little holes that let the water out, balance what comes in. And that's the normal state. Carbon dioxide is just like little piece of chewing gum that block up the holes. And it prevents these little escape valves. And because it does that, the water level gradually rises and it gets hot. It doesn't get very hot, but the point is we're so sensitive to temperature that even a tiny rise, 2 degrees is nothing, but it's everything for us. And that is basically all there is to it. It blocks up the little holes that otherwise infrared light get through. Now, the atmosphere is actually a dynamic system, so all these factors interact with each other. That's why it makes it very difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen. But the basics are just what I told you. That's all there is to it. And then one of the reasons that scientists get very upset with my Aunt Dorothy is that we've known this since the 1930s. And it's all based on understanding the wavelengths that get absorbed by different types of matter and so forth. And that was all figured out beginning in the 1880s. So if climate change is wrong, if it's a hoax, so you should tell your Aunt Dorothy, if she's telling you this, so is the rest of chemistry, right? She should not be worrying about climate change. She should immediately write new chemistry textbooks because she has made the most important discovery in hundreds of years in science if climate change is wrong. And so this is really, I think, important for everybody to know sort of the basics. You don't have to know the details because it's incredibly complicated, but the basics are not hard to understand. And part of the reason I wrote this book was to sort of sneak this all in.
And so lead us to agriculture. How does agriculture start forming itself into chewing gum that plugs these holes?
Okay. Well, agriculture is a main factor in climate change in a bunch of different ways. And what it is really is the big change is the invention of modern agriculture, industrial agriculture. And that, what Corby has done is cleverly given me a way back from this sidetrack I immediately launched into the subject of the book, because the wizard of my title is a guy named Norman Borlaug. And I would argue he is one of the most important people who was alive in the 20th century. Most people don't know who he is. He's the primary figure in what's been called the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is the combination of high-yielding seeds, advanced fertilizer, and irrigation that allowed grain yields in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to double, triple, even quadruple. And the way to say the change for that, it sounds sort of technical, is that when I went to high school in the 1970s, roughly 40% of the world was malnourished. That is 40% of the world, 40% of the people in the world didn't get enough food to eat at some point during the year and were chronically hungry. And now the figure is about 8%. Meanwhile, it's more impressive even than that, because in that time, the world's population has doubled. So right now, if a baby is born, it has less chance than ever in known history of being hungry. And that is, so sometime in the 1980s, we passed this extraordinary thing where we're living in historically unprecedented era in which the number of people who are hungry is going down and most people have enough to eat all the time. And that has a great deal to do with this guy, Norman Borlaug.
And in fact, the Green Revolution, that's a concept familiar to all of us, and I assumed was kind of post-war, late 40s. The term was coined in 1968, so recently. Mm-hmm. And when did the discoveries of Borlaug start being widely applied and the Green Revolution take root, so to speak?
In the 60s, they started bringing it to India. I mean, first it was begun, Borlaug was a farm boy from Iowa, from a very, very poor family, hated farm work, was anxious to escape from it, and where this horrible subsistence existence he had. His family got a tractor. One of Henry Ford's biggest innovations was the cheap tractor. And if you think about it, if you're a farmer without a tractor, you have to use draft animals, which are horses and oxen and so forth. And you spend a huge amount of time taking care of them, which is not fun if it's a job. And you also have to grow the food for them. So about 40% of your land typically is to grow food for the animals that you then spend all the time mucking and taking care of and so forth. You get a tractor, you can plant that land with something else. You don't have to take care of it. It's a huge change in people's lives, and it allowed Borlaug to become the first person in his family to graduate from high school, then college, and then get a PhD. And what he spent his entire life doing is trying to repeat this for other people. And so by a series of coincidences, he gets a job in central Mexico in the 1940s. And at that time, Mexico is poorer in a way that's very hard for us to imagine. About 2 out of 3 Mexicans don't have enough to eat. 60%, hunger. There's no country in the world today that's as poor as it. And it's an ecological disaster zone because all these people are scratching for a living in these ecologically sensitive areas. The national corn harvest is actually going down. And so the Rockefeller Foundation tries to set up a pilot project to see if there's something that can be done about it. Borlaug's on a sort of a splinter off of that because most people focus on corn, which is what Mexicans eat. He focuses on wheat. And kind of out of the radar, through an enormously hard work, he breeds wheat that is much more productive. And we can talk more about that. And he develops the methods of modern agriculture. This wheat is so productive, it needs a lot of fertilizer because there's not enough nutrients in the soil to actually grow it.
And this is where we cue the horror movie music.
Right.
It needs a lot, because everything sounds so good up to
Right, right. The problem is that this fertilizer becomes an enormous environmental problem because we don't really know how to apply it, and also poor farmers, aren't exactly able to use computers to monitor everything, and the fertilizer is cheap, so they pour it on. And about 40% of the fertilizer that gets applied to the world's farms doesn't stay on the farm, gets washed into oceans or goes up into the air. If it stays in the lower bounds, then nitrogen from the fertilizer creates all kinds of smog. It goes in the upper parts of the atmosphere. It contributes to the ozone layer problem. And most important, it washes into the oceans and creates these huge dead zones. The one in the Gulf of Mexico is about 7,000 square miles. The one in Bay of Bengal, which was measured for the first time a couple years ago, is 21,000 square miles. And there's dead zones all over the coast. So there's these NASA photographs
Do those all count as chewing gum? I'm still stuck on the chewing gum.
Oh, no, that's carbon dioxide. That's a different environmental question, right? But the point is that if it wasn't for climate change, nitrogen from excessive fertilizer would clearly be the world's worst environmental problem.
So the Green Revolution seems like a really good thing, but at the same time, there's this prophet, we have to get to the prophet side, named Stephen Vogt. William Vogt.
Stephen
Dutch
Vogt is a
farmer,
third baseman for the Cincinnati Reds, I think.
which is, of course, my entire field of reference. So thank you for explaining my confusion. So Vogt is 6th generation Long Island farmer, and he decides he's going to research what?
Well, he's from a poor family, and
also farming, so there are parallels. Poor farming, multi-generation family.
Multi-generational families. The difference is that his father runs off with a Tootsie when, that's the technical
Problem
term.
with Long Island, as we all in Connecticut know.
When he's 11 days old. And in small farming villages, this constitutes a scandal. And this one's actually quite a good scandal. It actually gets on the front page of the New York Times because the couple he runs off with a local rich person board, and they actually have a scandalous career. They end up in Cuba. It's pretty juicy. This is not good for somebody who's in a small farming town, as you can imagine. And the family ends up in the slums of Brooklyn, which he hates. His mother remarries, and he's just desperate to get to the country, where he wanted to live. And he's struck by polio there. I mean, it's just a catalog of awfuls. And like Borlaug, he becomes the first member of his family to graduate from high school and then graduate from college with a degree in French literature, which he acquires at the height of the Great Depression. As useful then as now. But he's saved by the fact that he's has, in his efforts to do something with nature, which is what he misses from his childhood, he becomes one of those dedicated bird watchers that your other aunt probably is one of, and is always trying to lure you. He's one of those guys, and it's the golden age of bird watching, and he is able to go to the American Museum of Natural History, which is where the great ornithologists of the world happen to be, and he gets to pal around with them. And this is like being a kid from nowhere who's a musician getting to, pal around with Mozart or something. He knows the most important biologists in the country. And they save him. And eventually, when he's unemployed, they get him a job in Peru, on these islands off the coast of Peru, which are the most awful places I've ever been. And there's a huge current that goes along the coast of Peru that's called the Humboldt Current. And it pulls up nutrients from the ground that have washed off the soil, and so it's very rich. And there's lots and lots of fish there, particularly anchovetas, which are a kind of anchovy. And it's one of the world's biggest fisheries. And there's zillions of birds that eat the anchovies, and they live on these islands. And they have been pooping there for millennia.
Now we get to the unpleasant part.
Yeah, so these islands are mountains of bird poop that are, at that time, were about 300 feet tall of bird poop, and they were mined as fertilizer, as the world's first high-intensity fertilizer. And so for Peru, it was the most important export they had, and they noticed that the supply of birds was diminishing. And so he was hired, in his words, to augment the increment of excrement. And so he spent, now if you can imagine a 9-mile square island that's entire surface is bird poop for 300 feet, there's not much that lives there except for birds and 1 billion flies. And so that's where he was for 3 years.
And you felt compelled to visit this place.
Well, I'm a journalist. We got to do these things. Although I have to say that when I got there, I thought, whoa, this is a mistake. I knew it was unpleasant, and I thought, well, I should see really how unpleasant it is, and it was that unpleasant.
So thank goodness it was you, not us. So that leads him to start sounding
Well, what happens
alarms.
is he becomes the guy who essentially realizes that what the El Nino system is, and that there's these recurring movements. Now, in fairness, what we should say is that this is something Peruvians have known forever, and it's in fact in indigenous chronicles and so forth. But he's the guy who understands it and puts it into the Western world, and he says, wait a minute, there's these recurring El Nino, La Nina cycles, and what happens is when the water warms up from these recurring El Ninos, the fish, like cold water, they move way out to sea. The birds can't reach them, and so they starve. And so you cannot actually increase the number of birds by more than so much, because nature puts a limit on it. And he said, wait a minute, the world is governed. This is the way the world works. The world is governed by these fundamental natural processes with limits that we transgress to our peril. And then he became the chief conservation officer for the Pan American Union. He went all over Latin America, and everywhere he saw what seemed to him to be people transgressing the limits of nature.
And he invents the term carrying capacity. Is it now or when?
He brings it out of an obscure corner of biology and makes it part. He's the guy who inflicted it on every high school biology student who learned about carrying capacity. You have William Vogt to thank. And he says the Earth has a carrying capacity. We're in danger of exceeding it. And he publishes in 1948 the first sort of modern "We're All Going to Hell" book. And Silent Spring, all those other books that come from it, the Population Bomb, Al Gore's books, they all stem from his book. And they all embed this fundamental idea, which is the Earth has limits and we're in danger of producing. And if you think about it, Borlaug, who's working simultaneously, is saying, no, the Earth doesn't have limits. We can push the limits out. And what we can do is use science and technology properly applied, and we can go full steam ahead.
1948 is this incredibly fertile year, because isn't that the year Sir Albert, founder of the organic movement?
Oh yeah, Albert Howard.
Albert Howard, isn't that the year of his great treatise based on
43,
his time?
but it comes in England. It comes in the United States.
1948, same year.
Yeah, no, but the 40s is all when these things happen. That's when organic farming starts, and then that book comes to the United States, and Rodale, the guy behind organic farming here in the United States, picks it up and creates the organic movement. And all these people are very much in sync with each other. And they become, the effects of this idea of limits, of the respect for natural processes, in all these different ways is incredibly powerful. And I would say in the book, I think this is correct, it's the only successful ideology that originated in the 20th century. There's nobody who says, I'm not an environmentalist. Even Scott Pruitt, right? It says, I'm an environmentalist. You're not allowed to say that. And it's a thing that didn't exist before 1948.
So can you try to paint a counter history of how Vogt and Borlaug could have been the best of friends and collaborators, and these movements could have been joined?
That's a really interesting question, because they are, no doubt, they're opposed to each other. You have, to this day, for example, you see this split wherever you go. There's a vocal contingent of scientists who are in favor of nuclear power, for example, and they say, look, it's carbon-free, it has the smallest footprint of any power source, and in fact, it's incredibly safe, and you can actually show that that solar power is actually more dangerous, has actually killed more people than nuclear power. And it's really true. It's because people fall off the roofs when they're installing them. And it's actually true. There's several hundred deaths per year from people falling off roofs, because it's actually dangerous to do work on roofs. I mean, it's not an inherent feature of solar power, but so there's these think tanks, in Switzerland that have collected the global data on deaths, and nuclear power is actually safer in that way than solar power. So that these people say, there's a pure Borlaugians, right? Let's have pocket nukes everywhere, and we've eliminated the problems from. And of course, the prophets say that nuclear power and the waste and so forth is an insult to the future. And basically, it's stuff we shouldn't tinker with because it's too dangerous. And that's an example of the sort of wizard prophet fight that you see. And it would have, so your question is, how can you do this? And I think it's actually quite tricky to do this, because at the bottom, they envision there are different ideas about what the good life is. And that's the thing I guess I would like to really leave you with, in addition to my tiny explanation of climate change, is that much of the arguments we hear about the environment are really sort of proxy arguments about what kind of life we should be living. People who like nuclear power and so forth typically like the idea of everybody being packed into cities where they maximize individual human beings' potential, and liberty and freedom, and we can all do whatever we want. People who are, the other type, the prophets that I call them, typically like the idea that we're all embedded in communities. They like the idea of small towns. It's Jefferson versus Hamilton. This is an argument that goes back a long way, and that it's very hard to deal with these arguments if you don't engage the actual values that are underneath them.
Well, you actually, I've had the luck to hear you give a long lecture that has to do with populations all migrating towards cities as a large result of the Green Revolution, because it made efficient farming on a large scale.
But also,
many fewer people.
It was plopped into these countries with social inequities. And so if you think about it, you're a poor farmer in Pakistan or India or Kenya or wherever, and now you can produce 4 times as much on your land. It's great, right? Except now what that means is your land is 4 times as valuable. It's worth stealing. And that's exactly what happened all over the world as a result. It was that with the active agreement of governments all over the world, poor farmers were kicked off their land, often in very brutal ways. And so what Borlaug had seen as this sort of freedom, right? I've got the tractor, I don't have to do this horrible work anymore, was actually on a global level massive dispossession that caused the great slums that we see now in places, all over the world.
Now, something we're about to, please queue up your questions, and we'll have the mic runners very alert. But what occurs to me when I think again about 1968 being the naming of the Green Revolution, this enormous scientific
progress. And that's
progress.
also when the population bomb was published.
Yes, that's right. It will feed the world. And then you have these enormous warning cries being sounded at the same time as there's this huge social movement against the Vietnam War that is suspicious of government, is suspicious of the establishment. Is it a coincidence that did environmentalism have a lot to do with the general counterculture movement of the late 60s?
Yeah, very much. I mean, people like Vogt were, on some sort of confused level, anti-capitalist, because they saw basically these, his book is full of thunderings against greedy American business people who are, building and growing heedlessly without any concern for the environment, and this will be catastrophic. This sort of growth mania, which he identified with capitalism. And we can certainly talk about whether that's an accurate identification, but that's the one that was made.
And was the Green Revolution associated with big bad industry and therefore the pollution from nitrogen and
It didn't have to be, but it was, historically. And what happened was that all over the world, people got thrown off the land and the lands got consolidated, usually at the behest of powerful forces in the society. And it didn't happen everywhere, but it happened in many places. And so then they got these giant industries that were created. And so this kind of giantism, which is something that the counterculture didn't like, became associated with it. It didn't have to work out that way, but that's the way it did in many places.
Great. Now, do we have any questions? We have a gentleman there. And the rules are quick identification of who you are, direct question.
Hi, I'm Akshat Rathi, and I'm a journalist with Quartz. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the problems of 21st century environment, where climate change is sort of this big, giant thing that's going to be a problem, but you have all the nitrogen fertilizer problem, these toxins going into the environment. How does the environmentalist of the 21st century handle the dual nature of where we are?
Whoa, that's not a small question, because there's so many different issues. I mean, I would say that they argue that the most immediate environmental issue, the one that's here today in a critical way, is water. Water contamination, pollution, degradation of all sorts is a huge issue, particularly in places like China. India's got serious water problems. They're just all over the place, Latin America. And so there you have a massive dispute between people who say that we have to take care of water reserves and and wetlands and all the things that it cause, and people who say no, we need to build giant desalination plants. And you see that in California, where there's a tremendous fight between the people who want to build 20 or 30 giant desalination plants on the California shore and the people who say that is crazy. We need to store existing water and maintain it and stop doing the crazy things that we're doing in California, like channeling the last remaining river underneath the San Diego, these giant water tunnels to bring it to Southern California. And I have to say, when you go to California, I have a wonderful cousin who just bought a house in Palm Beach, built 3 years ago, on a gigantic brand new golf course, built in the middle of the desert with water from thousands of miles away. It's not hard to think that's kind of nuts. So that's, I would say, is the most immediate global problem. Then you come to lots and lots of issues like biodiversity and so forth that are sort of more medium term. Nobody really knows how long it takes before the habitat loss that we're experiencing really results in massive extinctions. It's a giant area of uncertainty, but it's clear it will happen sometime. And then you have nitrogen. I think that nitrogen is actually maybe fixable. One of the big scientific discoveries that just happened a few weeks ago, I'm really kind of excited about, was that people in Oaxaca found, California researchers in Oaxaca found nitrogen fixing corn. Do you know what nitrogen fixing means? Yeah.
Just give us a refresher, because this took 38 years of work by a friend of mine, so I would like you to promote.
Oh, well, this is like incredible. Okay, there's these plants like soybeans that have symbiotic relationships with bacteria that take nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into a form that plants can use. And they actually make the soil richer. You don't need to fertilize them because they make their own fertilizer. That's right. And corn, which is this super fast growing plant, really drains the land. And turns out there's a variety of corn recently discovered in Oaxaca that actually does this. If this trait could be transferred and bred into other types of corn, the corn is the single biggest user of fertilizer in the world, even more than rice. And the idea of getting nitrogen fixing corn would just be a huge deal. And if you could take that trait and maybe find it in rice, you would do a huge step towards ending the nitrogen problem.
And a very good article was in the sister site to Quartz, The Atlantic, by Ed Young.
Extremely good, yeah. And actually, if you're curious about this, there's a terrific piece by Ed Young in The Atlantic.
And part of what you'll read is it's all open source research. So part of the deal that they made with Mexico, which allowed them to use lots of land races of corn, was that they would make it completely widely available, which is a nice new facet of some scientific research.
Yeah, he's dead right. He's my editor for a long time, so I can't disagree with him.
Yes,
right?
you can, because you know everything. Are there questions on this side? Do we have another? Yes.
Connie Casey. I'm a science journalist without a published book, unlike you. But genetically modified organisms, is this new corn such a thing? And will people call it a frankenfood, and that scientists are secretly hurting nature by doing genetic modifications?
No, this is not. This is an ancient race of corn. Oaxaca is the center of origin of corn. And if you go into the fields around Oaxaca, there are thousands of different varieties of corn. It's kind of a fascinating place to see, because they're just corn is incredibly genetically variable, and there's cobs this big to ones that are this big, this big. And so this is an ancient land race of corn that they've been growing in Mexico for a long time. And presumably you could actually transfer the trait to other types of corn through conventional breeding. I suspect that it would be much faster to use tools like, once they isolate whatever it is that, however this works, and assuming that it's some isolable thing, then you could transfer it by, any kind of modern means. And the question is, you'd be taking one type of corn and breeding its qualities into another type of corn. So
intra-species, not inter-species.
Right. It's a little bit like, people found favorable varieties, like the Meyer lemon. It is a natural thing, and people bred this sweetness in the Meyer lemon into all kinds of different varieties of lemon.
And it itself, a Meyer lemon, is a Eureka lemon, which is tart, and a mandarin,
right.
Sweet orange, native to Mexico.
So this is the same kind of thing. Whether they would actually do it that way, the traditional way, or if they would use the mechanisms of modern technology, I don't know.
And this is why I've started a Food and Society program at the Aspen Institute, because we're talking about exactly that question, Connie. So we have another question right here from the Orleanian.
Hi, Bernadette Murray. To what extent, since what you describe is so exciting and could be a whole new frontier for a capitalist, are big ag companies investing in this kind of research?
Which kind of research?
The natural fertilization research.
Oh, it's interesting. They're not actually that much. What there is there's a series of big ag type projects, most of which are being, one of the things that Borlaug did, Norman Borlaug, the wizard of my title, is he founded what became a series of 16 international laboratories to do food research and release the results for free. They're one of the great investments and creations of the 20th century, and they're under the general label of CGIAR, which is a terrible thing, which stands for Consultative Group of International Agro Research.
Is one of those ERIE?
ERIE, right. And so the one in the Philippines is the International Rice Research Institute, and that's the center of a giant project to do something different, which is to change the way photosynthesis works in rice. And so these big projects like this, that are sort of moonshot projects, have typically been done by foundations and public sector types of things. I expect that as it gets closer to being to reality, that the private sector will then try to jump in, but so far not much.
We have one more, and then I'm going to wrap up from Mr. Hormat.
Thanks, Bob Hormats. Years ago, I met an Indian who was a collaborator.
Swaminathan.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in Madras. And he indicated that one of the areas that India was working on was developing new strains of grain in particular that would produce larger quantities in very dry climates, and also using salt water, because India perceived that it would be a victim of global warming, and a lot of these coastal areas would be inundated with salt water, and then the drier areas would become even drier. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the future of this, because he was indicating this was one of the areas that India perceived as a major breakthrough area, and he and Borlaug actually had worked on this together. So I'm wondering where this stands. It was several years ago that I talked to him, but I'm curious as to how much progress has been made.
And pronounce his name again for
Okay.
us, because I
There's
was
a guy,
told never to mention the Green Revolution without this guy.
Right. Borlaug had an Indian partner named M.S. Swaminathan.
Right.
Mombasu Srinasavan Swaminathan, but M.S. Swaminathan, who was a really remarkable man. He's 93. He's still alive, still working in Tamil Nadu, which is in southeast Asia, in the city of Chennai. And he's worked with Borlaug. He's a totally amazing guy. I mean, at one point, he was the head of IRRI, the director of FAO, and I think the head of the International Union of the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources at the same time, which is mind-boggling. And so he's got a Swaminathan Foundation that is developing these, and they're in trials. I saw them a year and 2 months ago, I think it was, in Chennai, and they're he's underfunded, like all agricultural research, and because one of the problems has been that the Green Revolution has been so successful in the sense of filling people's bellies, that the funding for agricultural research has been declining for a couple of decades, and so they can't get the resources they need to really put it into production. But
So
it's really important, and I'm really glad you got a chance to mention it.
We now have a mandate for what we can support in addition to supporting this book. And
Well, support the research instead of the book if you only have one.
No. We're here to promote the book. But you see why I say there's nothing Charles Mann doesn't know and no place he hasn't been. So thank you for sharing some of
Thank you.
your infinite knowledge with us.
Thank you, Corby.